Picture a modern commander with satellite maps on a screen, supply charts flashing red, and advisors begging for a safer option. He studies an enemy fortress and says something no rational person wants to hear. We're not building one wall, we're building two, and the second one faces outward. Not to protect a city, not to guard a border, but to lock his own army inside a narrow corridor of earth and timber, an enemy trapped on one side and another enemy marching in from the horizon. That is the moment Julius Caesar steps into legend, at Alesia in 52 BCE. And here's the part that still feels unreal. Caesar doesn't just accept risk, he removes the exit button. He chooses a plan where retreat is not a path. It's an idea he deliberately kills. Because for Caesar, this isn't just a battlefield problem, it's a clock. Back in Rome, politics is sharpening its knives. Caesar's enemies don't need to defeat him in open combat, they only need him to look weak, to stumble, to lose control of Gaul for even a season. The moment his victories stop, his protection stops. In Roman life, losing your command can mean trials, exile, humiliation, and sometimes a quiet death that nobody writes poems about. So when Caesar's scouts bring news that Vercingetorix, the young Arvernian leader who has united the tribes, is inside Alesia with a large force, Caesar hears more than a report. He hears opportunity and danger speaking at the same time. Alesia sits high on a plateau, with steep slopes and river valleys like natural moats. From a distance, it looks almost carved out of the land itself. Wood and stone walls, towers and gates that seem to dare the world to climb up and try. It's the kind of place you don't assault lightly. And Vercingetorix knows that. From inside those walls, he can buy time. He can hold his warriors together. He can send messengers across Gaul calling every tribe that still believes in freedom to march to his relief. Caesar knows that too. So he faces a choice that every modern strategist would recognize. Attack the fortress directly and you gamble thousands of lives on steep slopes and narrow approaches. Pull back and keep the war mobile, and you give Vercingetorix what he wants most: time. To grow into a symbol that Rome can't easily break. Caesar chooses a third option, the one that feels insane until you see it through his eyes. He decides he will not take Alesia by storm. He will turn it into a locked room. The order goes out, and the Roman army becomes something else. Not just fighters, builders, engineers, a workforce trained to shape the earth like a weapon. They begin digging a ring around the plateau, not a loose blockade, not a line of tents, an actual engineered boundary. Ditches, ramparts, palisades, towers at regular intervals like the teeth of a machine. Everything measured, repeated, built to a standard. To a Roman legionary, digging isn't an extra task, it's doctrine. A Roman camp is a fort. A Roman march ends with walls. A Roman army doesn't simply arrive, it constructs. Day by day, the circle tightens. From the walls of Alesia, Gauls watch Romans work with a kind of disbelief. They shout, they gesture, they test the line with sudden sorties, quick rushes meant to interrupt construction, to force the builders to drop tools and pick up shields. But the Romans don't stop building. They build under pressure. They build with shields propped against arrows. They rotate men with a discipline that feels almost mechanical. And the more the Gauls push, the more the Romans seem to prove the same message. This is not a camp. This is a system. Inside Alesia, the reality is less heroic and more brutal. Supplies. You can't eat courage. A large force in a confined place becomes a countdown. Even a strong fortress can turn into a pantry with a shrinking shelf. Vercingetorix has chosen a position that is hard to break into, but it's also hard to feed. Now the story could end there, with a classic siege. Caesar builds a ring, starvation does the rest. But Alesia becomes famous for one reason. A second army is coming. Vercingetorix has called for relief, and the tribes answer. The exact numbers are debated. Ancient sources love exaggeration, and Caesar himself has every reason to make the odds look impossible. But the key truth doesn't change. A massive host is marching towards Alesia. And when Caesar receives confirmation of that approaching force, he faces the moment that separates good commanders from the rare ones history can't forget. Most leaders would back away, preserve the army, avoid being caught between two enemies, keep the legions alive for the next season. Caesar does the opposite. He decides the Roman army will not simply surround Alesia, it will surround itself. He orders the construction of a second wall, an outward-facing wall to protect against the relief army. Think about what that means in human terms. Imagine being a soldier, exhausted from days of digging and fighting off raids, and your commander says, "Good, now we build another wall, and this one isn't to keep them in, it's to keep everyone else out." Now you're trapped between the fortress on one side and an approaching storm of warriors on the other, not because you were defeated and cornered, because you chose it. That choice is why people later said Caesar buried his army, not literally under earth, but under a decision. Once the second wall rises, the only way out is through victory. This is where Caesar's mind becomes frighteningly modern. He's not trying to match numbers with numbers. He's trying to convert the battlefield into something controllable, into lanes, funnels, delays, into time. He wants every enemy advantage to arrive late, tired, disorganized, and confused. So the second ring isn't just a wall, it's layered defense. Ditches that slow feet and horses, ramparts that force attackers to climb, towers that give defenders sight and height, and then the field obstacles, simple objects placed with cruel intelligence, designed to break rhythm and momentum before anyone even reaches the line. To a modern viewer, it resembles the logic of an engineered perimeter. You don't rely on one barrier, you rely on layers, spacing, and predictable channels of movement. And while all of this is happening, Caesar's other war continues: logistics. He has to feed tens of thousands of men, plus cavalry and animals, while the land around him is hostile and stripped by scorched earth tactics. Every day his army digs, it burns calories. Every day he fortifies, he consumes supplies. The relief host is coming, and Caesar's stomach is also a battlefield. This is when morale begins to matter as much as timber and soil, because some Roman soldiers start to understand what they're building, not just walls, commitment. A vow that removes hesitation, and that realization can cut two ways. It can inspire or it can terrify. So Caesar does what great leaders still do today when strategy becomes psychologically dangerous. He becomes visible. He walks the lines, he speaks to crews, he watches the work, he makes it personal. Not with theatrics, with certainty. He's telling his army, in effect, this isn't a trap. This is the place where their numbers stop mattering. This is where we decide the terms of the fight. And gradually, the men stop asking, are we building our tomb? They start thinking, we're building the ground where we win. Then, the horizon changes. Dust begins to hang in the distance like a storm cloud that doesn't obey weather. Scouts return with the same message in different voices. The relief army is near. The host is vast. The world outside the outer wall is filling with banners. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watches too. From his ramparts, he can sense the moment approaching, the one he's been waiting for, the one his people have been starving for. Relief is coming. The net might break. The story might turn. Outside, Caesar stands on a tower and looks outward, calm in the wind. He has done the unthinkable. He has placed his army between two enemies and bet that Roman discipline, engineering, and planning can do what simple courage cannot. Hold the line in both directions, long enough for the enemy to collapse under its own weight. And as the first wave of the relief host comes into view, one truth settles over the battlefield like cold fog. Alesia is no longer just a siege. It is a test of systems against a nation in motion.
Gaul was never a single country. It was a patchwork. Tribes, rival chiefs, old feuds that could last longer than a human lifetime. To Rome, it was convenient to call it all Gaul, the way an empire uses one word to simplify what it doesn't want to understand. But on the ground, it was dozens of peoples with different customs, different leaders, and different memories of who wronged them last. That's why what happened in 52 BCE was so shocking. Vercingetorix wasn't just another chieftain with a loud voice and a sharp sword. He was something rarer, a political mind in a warrior's world. An Arvernian noble with the kind of authority that comes from birth, and the kind of authority that comes from knowing exactly how fear and hope move through a crowd. For years, Julius Caesar had been moving across Gaul like a machine with a heartbeat. He fought hard, yes, but more importantly, he moved fast. His legions could appear where no one expected, build a fortified camp in hours, and punish resistance with a speed that felt almost unnatural. One season you were independent, The next season, you were negotiating terms. Caesar understood something modern leaders still live with. Conquest isn't only about winning battles, it's about controlling the story afterward. Installing friendly leaders, taking hostages, demanding loyalty, turning yesterday's enemy into tomorrow's supplier. But conquest is not the same thing as control. And by 52 BCE, the pressure had reached a breaking point. The Roman presence was heavier, the taxes and demands felt endless, and the tribes were beginning to realize that if they didn't act together, they would be taken apart one by one. Each tribe watching the next one fall, hoping they would be spared, until no one was left to bargain. That's the opening Vercingetorix stepped into. He didn't unite Gaul by pretending old feuds didn't exist. He united it by reframing the moment. He made the choice feel simple: keep fighting each other or survive. And survival is persuasive. If you want to imagine his rise as a myth, it would sound like this. The sky over central Gaul turns the color of iron. Ravens gather on bare branches above council circles. The wind carries smoke from distant farms, and men begin to whisper that the old gods are paying attention again. Not because magic is happening, because people under pressure always search for meaning. In Roman camps, soldiers would have their own language for it. They'd say Mars is restless. They'd say Fortuna, luck herself, hasn't chosen a side yet. And every Roman knows the same warning. Fortuna can be loyal, but she's never predictable. In Gaul, belief didn't wear Roman names. It wore older ones. Taranis in the thunder. Teutates in the tribe's breath. Ebona in the rhythm of horses and hooves. When you're preparing for something bigger than your own life, religion isn't decoration, it's fuel. Vercingetorix used that fuel carefully. And then he made the first hard decision that separates leaders from performers. He chose scorched earth. From a modern perspective, it's brutal in a very specific way. It targets logistics, not pride. Caesar's legions needed grain, cattle, forage. They were professionals, but they still had stomachs. They still needed animals to carry supplies, horses to scout and strike, and roads that could support movement. So, Vercingetorix tried to deny Caesar the land itself. Farms burned, storehouses emptied, wells were damaged where possible. Not for drama, not for cruelty as a goal, but because it was a rational attempt to break an invading system. If Rome fed itself off your countryside, then your countryside became a weapon. A harsh weapon, but one you could control. And if you've ever watched modern conflicts, you know this logic hasn't disappeared. Armies collapse when fuel, food, and transport fail. The tools change, but the pressure points are the same. The smoke rising over Gaul wasn't just destruction. It was a message aimed directly at Caesar. You will not live off us anymore. At the same time, Vercingetorix began turning diplomacy into a battlefield. He called councils. He sent messengers along forest tracks and river routes. He demanded warriors, hostages, supplies. He didn't ask politely, because he understood that a coalition held together by politeness breaks at the first real cost. Unity had to be hardened early, while emotions were high. So he built a shared purpose fast, before doubt could breathe. Some chiefs resisted, of course they did. Old feuds don't vanish because a young noble gives a speech. But Vercingetorix was skilled at applying pressure without shattering the structure. He offered honor when possible, he used threat when necessary, and he kept one idea at the center of every meeting. Rome doesn't negotiate with equals, Rome negotiates with subjects. If Gaul wanted to remain Gaul, it had to think like fragments and start thinking like a single body. And for a brief moment, it worked. You can picture it across the landscape. Camps multiplying on open plains, fires dotting the night like a second sky. Blacksmiths working late, sparks rising into smoky air. Warriors repainting shields with tribal emblems, boars, horses, and suns, symbols of identity made visible for the battles ahead. Cavalry practicing coordinated turns on open heathland, dust lifting in golden light, hooves striking earth in rhythms that felt like an oath. And under it all, a growing realization: this is bigger than any one tribe. Meanwhile, Caesar wasn't blind. Roman scouts moved constantly. Germanic allied cavalry ranged wide, hard riders who could cover distance quickly and return with what Caesar valued most: information. The Romans read smoke on the horizon like sailors read clouds. They saw burned fields and knew exactly what it meant. And in Roman camps, the tone shifted. Because a professional soldier knows the difference between a rebellion and a coordinated uprising. One can be contained, the other can become a war that swallows careers. Caesar's genius, one of his most modern qualities, was that he treated war as a single contest. He treated it as overlapping systems: political time in Rome, morale in his legions, logistics in hostile territory, alliances that could flip, and the psychological effect of momentum. He understood that Vercingetorix wasn't simply raising warriors, he was raising a narrative. A story that said we can resist if we do it together. And Caesar had built his entire identity on the opposite story. Resistance is futile because Rome is inevitable. So this was more than a campaign. It was a collision of beliefs. You can feel that in the quieter moments. A Roman soldier at night, sitting near a small fire, rubbing tired eyes, fingers brushing a little charm or standard emblem, half superstition, half habit, then staring into darkness where he knows an entire country might be moving. A Gaulish rider tightening a horsehair charm on a bridle, not because it guarantees victory, but because it makes fear feel organized. A mother tying a protective token to her son's belt in a smoky roundhouse, both pretending it's routine so neither has to say goodbye out loud. That is what rebellion really looks like. Not banners in sunlight, but ordinary people trying to steady themselves. By the time Vercingetorix rides along his assembled lines, inspecting warriors, speaking briefly, making eye contact, the transformation is visible. Men who would once have fought each other are now standing under shared signals. Tribal tokens clink into a common bowl. Oaths are spoken at standing stones, and the host begins to move, columns stretching through misty valleys like a river of bodies and banners. And far away, on Roman roads, the legions march with their own rhythm, shields, packs, and armor moving with the weight of a disciplined machine. Two forces, two ideas, two leaders. And as the dust rises from thousands of feet and hooves, you can sense where this is heading. Towards a fortress on a plateau, where one man will try to trap another, and both will discover what it costs when a nation chooses to speak with one voice. Alesia didn't look like a place you attacked. It looked like a place you respected or avoided. From the valleys below, the plateau rose like a stone ship grounded in the hills of Gaul. Two small rivers, cold, winding, and stubborn, cut through the land and helped frame the fortress with natural barriers. Up top, the epitom's walls combined timber, stone, and packed earth in a style the Romans knew well. Strong, springy under impact, and built to punish anyone who tried to climb. If you were Vercingetorix, it felt like the gods had handed you a shield. If you were Caesar, it felt like a riddle. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix pulled his forces back through the gates and sealed them. The streets tightened with people and smoke, storehouses filled, horses were stabled. Warriors took turns on the ramparts, scanning the slopes as if their eyes could slow time itself. He wasn't hiding, he was setting a stage, buying days, maybe weeks, until the relief army he'd summoned could arrive. But a fortress is not just walls, it's also mouths. And in any siege, the most dangerous weapon is arithmetic. Not dramatic arithmetic, just the slow, ordinary kind. How much grain is left? How fast it shrinks? How many people you can feed before hunger becomes louder than loyalty? Vercingetorix could feel that clock ticking in every ration bowl. Then Caesar arrived. You can imagine the moment his column broke out of the trees and into open land, red standards catching the light, helmets and chainmail flashing through dust, the steady rhythm of a professional army that had done this 100 times. Caesar rode with his officers at the front, calm, scanning the plateau like a man reading terrain the way other men read faces. He didn't come alone. He had legions, roughly 10, perhaps more depending on how you count detachments, and cavalry allies who could range far beyond the camp lines. The numbers matter less than the shape of what he brought: experience, engineering, and a chain of command that could turn orders into motion without argument.
Caesar stopped where he could see Alesia clearly, and he understood the obvious truth immediately. A direct assault would be expensive. Steep slopes, narrow approaches, defenders above throwing everything downward. Even if the Romans succeeded, they might pay a price that would echo all the way back to Rome, where Caesar's political enemies waited like creditors. So he did what his mind always did under pressure. He looked for the option that changed the rules. That night, Roman tents rose in clean lines below the plateau. Ditches were cut, stakes were planted, fires flickered in a growing rectangle of order. To the Gauls watching from above, it must have looked like a new city being built at their feet, silent, methodical, and unsettling. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix walked the ramparts and watched the campfires multiply. He expected pressure, he expected threats, but what he saw was something colder: preparation. He called councils, he checked stores, he sent messengers out through narrow paths and dark woods, urging the tribes to hurry, to march, to bring everything they could. His entire plan depended on time arriving in the form of an army. Outside, Caesar built his answer. The next morning, he gave the order that transformed the siege into something almost unreal. He would not storm Alesia, he would encircle it. And his legions, trained to dig as naturally as they marched, began cutting a ring into the earth. Engineers measured and staked the line. Work parties dug trenches. Others carried wicker baskets of soil, building the beginnings of a rampart behind the ditch. Timber was cut and sharpened for a palisade. Towers started to rise at intervals, turning the whole line into a continuous watchful spine. This wasn't just construction, it was psychology. Every foot of trench said to the defenders, the outside world is moving farther away. Every tower said, we will be here tomorrow. Every completed section narrowed Vercingetorix's options, one measured step at a time. Of course, Vercingetorix didn't watch politely. He launched sorties, sudden attacks meant to disrupt the work before it could become permanent. Gaulish warriors rushed downhill, aiming for the unfinished sections where the earth was still soft and the palisade incomplete. And this is where Rome's discipline becomes its own kind of weapon. The Romans didn't abandon the project to fight. They fought to protect the project. They raised shields, formed lines, pushed the attackers back, and then, almost immediately, returned to digging, like a machine that pauses only long enough to clear an obstruction. From a modern viewpoint, it's a lesson in priorities. Caesar wasn't trying to win every skirmish. He was trying to complete a system. The system would win the siege. The ring grew. Inside Alesia, the pressure grew too, and not only from hunger. There's a particular fear that comes when you're surrounded, and you can see the boundary tightening. It's not panic yet. It's worse than panic. It's realization. Vercingetorix walked through granaries where sacks were stacked high, but no longer felt infinite. He watched attendants count, measure, and scratch tallies into wood. He knew that every day Caesar built outside was a day supplies died inside. And he also knew that his best hope was still the relief army. Somewhere beyond the hills, beyond the forests and rivers, Gaul was gathering. He believed the tribes would come. He had united them after all. He had given them a story strong enough to march behind. But belief still has to travel on roads, and Caesar understood that too. At night, in his command tent, Caesar studied the plateau and the valleys like a man studying a lock. He placed markers, he traced lines, he thought more like an engineer than a warrior, and gradually the siege stopped being a circle of men and became a circle of design. By the time the circumvallation, the inward-facing ring, neared completion, Alesia already felt different. The gates were still there, the walls still stood, but the fortress had shifted from stronghold to container, a prison made of its own geography. Then came the whisper that changed the tone of everything. Dust on the horizon. Scouts began to report movement far beyond the Roman lines, columns forming, banners appearing and disappearing in the haze. The relief army was not a rumor anymore. It was becoming a physical presence in the landscape. Caesar rode the works at dawn, inspecting ditches, watching towers rise, speaking to engineers with short, precise gestures. He was racing time, and he knew it. Vercingetorix, high above, watched the Roman ring with a tightening jaw. He had chosen Alesia because it was hard to take. Now he realized the trap inside that strength. If Caesar sealed the circle completely, Vercingetorix's army might still be alive, but alive on borrowed days. And as the last gaps in the Roman line shrank, the siege crossed a threshold. This was no longer a simple contest of walls versus ladders. It had become something larger. Two leaders trying to control time itself. Caesar was building a world of trenches and towers where discipline could outweigh numbers. Vercingetorix was holding a fortress long enough for the horizon to deliver salvation. And somewhere out there, beyond the hills, the dust kept rising.
By the time Caesar committed to the first ring around Alesia, the battle had already changed shape. This wasn't Rome standing at a safe distance, waiting for hunger to do the work. This was Rome carving the landscape into a weapon, under the eyes of the fortress, under the sting of arrows, under a deadline only Caesar could see clearly. At dawn, the work parties formed up below the plateau. Not in chaos, not with shouting and improvisation, but with the quiet rhythm of men who'd done this across Gaul for years. Engineers set stakes and pulled cords tight across the uneven ground. Centurions broke the labor into sections. A ditch line began as a scratch in the soil, and then deepened into something you couldn't ignore. To the Gauls watching from Alesia's ramparts, it must have looked wrong. Armies were supposed to fight, not build. But Roman legions were built for exactly this: war as construction, construction as war. The trenches widened, the cut earth piled into berms behind them. The Romans packed that soil down hard, layer by layer, until it stopped being dirt and started being a wall. Timber revetments reinforced the edges, sharpened stakes went up as a palisade. Towers rose at regular intervals, giving eyes and height to every stretch of line. Even the weather was pulled into the plan. Where the ground allowed, water was diverted into sections of ditch. Not a dramatic flood, just enough to make the approach slower, heavier, more uncertain. A man who has to think about his footing is a man who arrives late to the fight. That was the point. Vercingetorix understood the danger immediately. He didn't wait for the ring to close politely. He sent sorties, sudden, forceful rushes aimed at the unfinished sections, where the rampart was still low and the ditch not yet deep. For a moment, the scene looks like it might become what the Gauls want: a disruption, a break in the rhythm, a chance to tear the project open before it can become permanent. But Caesar's legions respond the way they've been trained to respond. They don't abandon the work, they protect it. Cohorts step forward, shields interlock, and the line becomes a moving barrier. The Romans press the attackers back just far enough to stabilize the construction zone. Then the builders step right back in. Tools return to hands, soil returns to baskets, stakes return to the rampart. From a modern perspective, it's almost chilling. Caesar isn't trying to win every clash. He's trying to finish the system. The system is the victory condition. You can see it in the way the Romans rotate men under pressure. Front ranks absorb the strain, then step back. Fresh ranks step forward. Not because they're fearless, but because Rome is organized enough to keep fear from becoming disorder. Daylight fades, and the work doesn't stop. Torches ignite along the growing line. Hammer strikes echo. Shovels bite into mud. Men tamp the rampart in steady beats until exhaustion feels like a background noise. The first ring, Caesar's inward-facing circumvallation, becomes visible as more than a plan. It becomes a physical boundary around Alesia, tightening like a belt. Inside the fortress, the consequences begin to show. Grain stores that once looked high start looking finite. Rations shrink quietly, without speeches. The tally marks on wooden boards multiply. You don't need panic for morale to crack. You only need the sense that tomorrow will be worse than today. Vercingetorix walks through the granary district and feels the weight of every sack. Not just the physical weight, but the political weight. Every mouth inside Alesia is a vote. Every hungry warrior is a question. How long can you keep your promise? On the walls, his officers watch the Roman towers multiply. They watch the ditches deepen.
They watch the rampart rise. And there's a particular kind of fear that comes when you realize the enemy isn't improvising. He's building a template. Outside, Caesar rides the line at dawn, inspecting the trenches. He speaks to engineers in short gestures. He points at bends in the line that need strengthening. He doesn't need to shout. His confidence is contagious, and his men know the difference between a commander who hopes and a commander who expects. The Gauls attempt another disruption. They open the gates again, surge down the slope, and collide with the Roman line near an unfinished sector. The Romans absorb it, push it back, and return to work. Again. And that repetition is the real weapon, not a single heroic moment, but the relentless refusal to be interrupted. Soon the ring approaches completion. From above, Alesia no longer looks like a fortress surrounded by an army. It looks like a fortress surrounded by a structure. Ditches, ramparts, palisades, towers, and the red flash of Roman standards marking each sector as if the earth itself has been claimed. At night, campfires burn in a long curve below the plateau. Patrols pace the parapets. Horn signals carry faintly across fog-filled valleys. And even nature seems to respond. Rain slicks the trench walls, forcing Romans to shore them up with timber. Then, the next morning, pale sun strikes the flooded ditch and turns it into a ribbon of cold light. From the Gallic side, the view is worse. Vercingetorix stands on the rampart at sunrise and watches the Roman ring become continuous. That moment, when the last gaps shrink and the line becomes unbroken, is not a clash of armies, it's a closing door. The gates of Alesia still exist, the walls still stand, but the world outside has been reorganized. Now there is Rome, and there is everything trapped inside the ring. And as Caesar's scouts begin to notice faint dust far beyond the outer horizon, the siege gains a second heartbeat. Everyone understands what comes next. The relief army is on its way. Caesar has finished the first part of his plan. He has turned a fortress into a container. The next part will decide whether that container becomes a prison for Vercingetorix or a grave for his own ambition. Because once the relief host arrives, the Romans aren't just surrounding Alesia. They're standing between two storms, one inside the walls and one rolling in from the plains.
The first time a Roman lookout saw the dust on the horizon, he probably didn't understand what he was really seeing. Not at first. Just a smudge where the sky meets the earth, like weather that doesn't belong. Then the smudge grew. On the towers of the outer line, sentries leaned forward, squinting into the wind. Flags snapped harder, horns carried farther, and the message moved down the fortifications the way electricity moves through a wire. Something big is coming. In Caesar's command area, the report arrived without poetry. A runner, breath burning, dust on his cloak, pointing toward the plain. Officers gathered around map boards and markers. For a brief moment, the entire siege held its breath, because everyone knew what this meant. Vercingetorix's relief army was real. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a moving mass of tribes and banners, turning the horizon into a threat. This is the point where most commanders choose the safe option. Most leaders pull back. Most generals preserve the army and refuse to be pinned between two enemies. Caesar didn't. He looked at the fortress behind him, looked at the open country ahead, and made the decision that still makes military historians pause. He ordered a second wall. Not another camp, not a stronger guard line, a full outward-facing ring of fortifications, built to face the approaching relief host, which meant the Roman army would now be living inside a narrow corridor of earth and timber, trapped by choice between Alesia and the wide plain of Gaul. When you say it out loud, it sounds like madness, but from Caesar's point of view, it was something else. It was control. If he stayed mobile, he would be fighting on ground chosen by his enemies. If he withdrew, he would leave Vercingetorix alive as a symbol. If he attacked Alesia directly, he would gamble everything on steep slopes and narrow approaches. But if he built a second ring, he could force both enemies to fight inside a space designed by Roman hands. So the orders spread.
Cohorts redeployed. Engineers measured new lines with cords and stakes. Work parties turned outward and began cutting ditches into the earth again, fresh scars around an already wounded landscape. The sound of shovels returned. The steady beat of rammers returned. Timber was carried, lifted, and set in place. And all of it had to happen fast because the relief army was not waiting politely while Rome prepared. Every hour mattered. Every beam, every ditch, every tower was a race against a horizon that kept moving closer. The Gauls on Alesia's walls watched this with disbelief. The first ring had been shocking enough. The second ring was something else entirely. It was Caesar refusing to leave, refusing to blink, refusing to admit that numbers could decide his fate. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix saw this with the same fear and felt the meaning immediately. The Romans weren't just surrounding him anymore. They were building a fortress against the whole of Gaul. For Vercingetorix, that was infuriating and frightening because it implied Caesar believed he could hold, and belief in war is contagious. Outside, Caesar's plan demanded more than courage. It demanded supply. Feeding a large army while building 2 walls is not a heroic image. It's exhaustion, rationing, and hard decisions. Wagons creaked through mud. Grain sacks were unloaded with shoulders already sore from digging. Water skins were refilled, passed along lines, and guarded like treasure. Even the simplest tasks carried pressure because every day of construction burned strength. And Caesar knew that if hunger reached his own men first, the walls would become a prison instead of a weapon. So he kept his cavalry active. Germanic allied horsemen ranged beyond the works to gather food and information, moving like shadows along ridgelines and returning with news. Their job wasn't glory, it was time. Buying hours, buying days, buying enough space for the second ring to rise. Then came the detail that made the outward wall truly dangerous. It wasn't just a rampart and a ditch, it was the ground in front of it. Caesar ordered layered obstacles, simple materials arranged with brutal intelligence. Logs set low and angled, meant to disrupt a straight approach. Concealed pits, lightly covered, forcing attackers to slow and probe. Small iron spikes scattered in the earth, invisible until the last second, making feet hesitate and formations lose rhythm. In modern terms, it was battlefield design. Caesar wasn't trying to defeat the relief army by strength alone. He was trying to make their strength arrive in pieces, to make the enemy's movement uncertain, to force them to hesitate, to make the ground itself argue with them. At the same time, between the inner and outer rings, Caesar turned the corridor into a nervous system. Reserves were placed at junctions, runners practiced routes, signal flags and horns were positioned so orders could travel faster than panic. If pressure rose on one sector, the system could respond before the line snapped. And there was one more battle Caesar had to win before any enemy touched the wall: his own men's thoughts. Because a soldier understands digging, a soldier understands defending a camp, but building a second wall facing outward is different. It's a statement that says there is no easy way out. In the corridor between the 2 rings, whispers began. Not mutiny, something quieter. Doubt. Caesar didn't ignore it. He walked the line. He stepped into the lantern light. He spoke calmly. He didn't promise comfort. He promised meaning. He made them understand they weren't building a trap, they were building a place where Roman discipline could turn the enemy's numbers into a disadvantage. And it worked. Men returned to their posts, helmets went on, straps were tightened, the outer gate beams were set with heavy, final thuds, as if Rome itself had closed the door behind them. Then, one morning, the fog lifted just enough to reveal what everyone had been dreading. The dust on the horizon was no longer a smudge. It was an approaching world. Caesar climbed a tower and looked outward, cloak tugged by wind, expression steady. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix looked out from his ramparts and saw the same thing. Relief had arrived. And between those 2 forces, between hope and control, stood Caesar's second wall, freshly built, waiting to prove whether this was genius or the most expensive mistake of his life. Inside Alesia, the siege stopped feeling like war and started feeling like a countdown. The streets were still there, the ramparts still stood, fires still burned in hearths and forges, but the sound beneath everything had changed. It was quieter now,
Less shouting, fewer celebrations, more careful footsteps, more whispered conversations, more eyes drifting toward the granaries as if food could disappear simply by being noticed. Vercingetorix understood the problem in the simplest possible terms. Walls do not feed people. A fortress can protect an army from blades and arrows, but it can't protect an army from time. Every day Caesar held the ring, the same question returned. How long can we endure this? In the storehouses, the piles looked smaller than they did yesterday. In the ration line, bowls were filled a little less. Not dramatically, not enough to cause panic, but enough that everyone felt it. Hunger doesn't need to announce itself loudly. It only needs to show up every morning and refuse to leave. And then, Vercingetorix made the decision that reveals the true nature of siege warfare, how it forces leaders into choices that don't feel like choices at all. He ordered the non-combatants sent out of Alesia. Women, children, the elderly, people who could not fight but still needed food. It was a practical move, as harsh as it was. Fewer mouths inside meant the defenders could last longer. If the relief army arrived soon, those people might survive. If Caesar allowed them passage, the siege might become bearable. From the outside, the gate opened and a slow procession began down the slopes. Not an escape, more like an offering to reality. They crossed into the cold space between Alesia and Rome's inner wall, what modern soldiers would call no man's land, a strip of grass and mud under watchtowers where every step felt exposed. Roman sentries saw them approach. From a distance, it must have been surreal. Not a sortie, not a battle line, just civilians moving carefully, carrying bundles, looking up at the Roman rampart as if the wall itself could answer. This is the moment where modern viewers usually expect a humane solution, a corridor, a passage, a compromise. But Caesar did not open the line. He refused to let them through. Not because he didn't understand what it meant. Caesar was not blind. He knew exactly what he was doing, and that is what makes it so heavy. His logic was brutally simple. If those people passed through, Alesia would consume fewer supplies, and the fortress could hold longer. A longer siege meant a higher risk for Rome, especially with a relief army already approaching. To Caesar, allowing passage was not mercy. It was an extension of the enemy's endurance. So the Roman line stayed closed. Gates remained barred. The sentries did not move. And suddenly, those civilians were trapped in the open, caught between two walls, denied by Rome, unable to return to a city that had already accepted it could not feed them all. That night, fog rolled into the low ground. Torches burned on both ramparts like distant stars. The people below huddled in the cold, trying to become small enough to be overlooked by history. This is siege warfare at its most honest. No heroic speeches, no clean victories. Just human beings paying for the logic of commanders who cannot afford to be sentimental. Vercingetorix stood on Alesia's rampart and looked down. He had united tribes that had hated each other for generations. He had made them speak with one voice. But now he watched that unity crack under hunger and grief. Not because his warriors stopped believing in freedom, but because freedom doesn't fill empty bowls. Inside the oppidum, he gathered the chiefs again. The arguments weren't loud now. They were tired. Some wanted to keep fighting. Some wanted to attempt a breakout. Others looked at the faces around the fire and understood that a leader's pride can become a weapon pointed inward. Vercingetorix listened, then raised a hand for silence. In that moment, he wasn't just a warrior. He was the manager of collapse, trying to decide what kind of ending would leave something alive afterward. If not independence, then at least a future. Outside the walls, Rome held its discipline. On the inner rampart, Roman patrols paced with lanterns swinging in the wind. Some soldiers stared down at the stranded civilians and tightened their grips on shield straps, not out of aggression, but out of discomfort. It takes training to stand still when the human impulse is to act. Caesar sat with his maps and his calculations, tracing the shape of his ring, then tracing the routes his supplies had to take to keep his legions fed. In his mind, the siege wasn't just a moral problem, it was a systems problem, and systems don't care how you feel. At dawn, frost clung to the grass. The civilians below the walls stirred stiffly, and the sight became a kind of silent message to both armies. To the Gauls inside Alesia, it was proof that Rome would not bend. To the Romans, it was proof that the siege would demand more than courage. It would demand emotional control. And above them all, the larger war kept moving. Lookouts on the outer wall still watched the horizon. Horns and flags still stood ready.
Dust still hung in the far distance, hinting that the relief army would soon force the real test of Caesar's gamble. So part 6 of this story isn't about a clash of armies. It's about what happens when two leaders, Caesar and Vercingetorix, are trapped inside their own logic. Vercingetorix tries to save his people by buying time. Caesar tries to win the war by refusing to give time. And between those two decisions, in the cold fog beneath the walls, you can feel the true cost of Alesia, not measured in numbers, but in the silence that follows when mercy becomes another battlefield.
At dawn, the horizon outside Alesia stopped looking like empty land and started looking like movement. From the Roman towers on the outer wall, sentries watched the plain darken, not with weather, but with people. A broad dust front rolled low across the fields, and under it came banners, clustered warbands, horses, and the shifting mass of a relief army that felt too large to count from that distance. It didn't matter whether it was 50,000 or twice that or more. To the men on the parapet, the feeling was the same. An entire country was walking toward them. On the outer rampart, flags snapped in the wind. Horns carried measured calls along the line. Caesar's signals moved from tower to tower with a precision that looked almost calm, because calm was the point. The outer wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a nervous system. It was designed to turn chaos into information, and information into action. Caesar stood on a tower platform, cloak tugged by cold wind, looking outward across the obstacle fields and ditches. Alesia rose behind him like a second enemy in stone and timber. Ahead was the approaching host. He had placed himself between them and built a world where retreat wasn't an option. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix saw the same dust. For him, it wasn't only danger, it was relief. It was the answer to hunger. It was proof that the tribes had come. On the ramparts, banners lifted higher. Warriors tightened straps and checked shields. Hope can change posture. You could see it in the way men stood straighter as the horizon filled. And then, the fighting began. Not as one clean moment, but as pressure. The relief army didn't rush blindly into the Roman works. Its forward elements moved cautiously, probing the ground. The obstacles were already doing their job. The Scipi, angled logs and sharpened stakes, forced men to weave instead of charge. Concealed pits made everyone test footing. Iron spikes hidden in mud turned confidence into careful steps. If you want a modern way to understand it, Caesar had engineered uncertainty. He made the battlefield feel unreliable. And when the ground can't be trusted, speed disappears. When speed disappears, coordination starts to fray. Still, the relief army had numbers and determination. As more warbands gathered, the probing turned into a push. Dense lines advanced toward the outer ditch, banners high, and the air filled with dust and noise. On the outer Roman parapet, defenders waited until the range was right, then responded with disciplined rhythm. Pila arced outward in coordinated volleys. Artillery crews on towers worked their torsion machines with steady efficiency. Archers released in cadence, not in panic. Rome wasn't trying to match fury with fury. Rome was trying to maintain a system. Below, at the Dica edge, the relief warbands faced the first real problem: geometry. The cut earth forced men to slow, to jump carefully, to search for narrow points, to improvise crossings with boards and bundles. Every second spent doing that was a second they weren't pressing the wall. Every hesitation created gaps. Every gap created confusion. And as the outer fight intensified, Vercingetorix moved. From inside Alesia, war horns sounded and gates opened. Warriors surged down the slopes toward the Roman inner wall, determined to strike from within, while the relief host struck from without. This was the moment Caesar had built two walls for, the nightmare scenario where Rome must defend in both directions at once. On the inner wall, Roman cohorts turned to face Alesia. They rotated positions with the same discipline used during construction: front ranks stepping back, fresh ranks stepping forward, shields aligning, spacing corrected. The inner line held because it was treated like a machine that had to keep running. Between the two walls, the corridor became a living bloodstream of movement. Runners carried orders, officers pointed to sector markers, reserve cohorts marched in short blocks toward threatened points, then halted and faced a direction they were needed. Flags and horns translated Caesar's will into motion faster than fear could spread. For a long stretch of that day, the struggle was everywhere at once. On the outside, the relief army pressed the obstacle fields and ditches, trying to find a seam. On the inside, Vercingetorix pushed against the inner line, trying to turn hunger into a final burst of force. And then, slowly, the relief host began to concentrate. Gaulish commanders identified a rugged sector of the Roman outer wall where the terrain was awkward, steep, broken, harder to fortify perfectly. It wasn't the magical weak spot, but it was a place where a focused effort might work. So they formed a spear point, selected warbands, banners clustered, men tightening straps and stepping forward as a unit. You could feel the intention shift. This wasn't probing anymore. This was a plan. Rome saw it too. Along that rugged sector, Roman defenders reinforced positions, checked tower crews, and tightened the rhythm of signals. Caesar watched from his tower and began repositioning reserves between the walls, not with dramatic speeches, just short gestures that set entire units in motion. Night came and still the pressure did not fully disappear. Torches ignited along both walls, wind dragged smoke across the ditch lines, shadows stretched long across the obstacles, making every step outside the wall feel uncertain. The Gauls continued to test the line. The Romans continued to push ladders away, to hold the parapets, to reset positions. Dawn returned, and the field looked different. Dust hung low. Abandoned ladders and broken gear lay scattered where the obstacle fields had turned bold movement into cautious movement. Roman crews resupplied towers with arrows and bolts. The relief host gathered around fires, commanders tracing plans in dirt, pointing at the same sector again and again. The story had narrowed. This was no longer a siege happening in a circle. It was becoming a duel over one seam in the wall, one place where the relief army believed it could break in before hunger finished the job inside Alesia. On the ramparts of the Oppidum, Vercingetorix watched the relief campfires and understood what he needed: timing. If the relief host hit the seam with enough force at the right moment, his own warriors had to strike from within at the same time, pulling Roman attention in both directions until something gave way. And on the Roman towers, Caesar watched the relief host tighten its formation. He could see the spear point forming in the way banners clustered and lines aligned. He didn't look surprised. He looked ready. Because Caesar hadn't built two walls to gamble on hope. He built them to turn the battle into a problem he could solve. And now, as the wind snapped both Roman vexilia and Gallic banners in the same cold dawn gust, everyone at Alesia understood the truth. The decisive strike was coming. Before sunrise, the weak sector of Caesar's outer wall felt like the edge of the world. The ground there was broken limestone and awkward slopes, harder to level, harder to reinforce, harder to make perfect. The Romans had done everything they could: deeper ditches, extra stakes, tighter tower spacing, but everyone could sense it. If the relief army was going to gamble on one seam, it would be here. Out on the plain, the Gallic relief warbands gathered into tighter blocks, banners clustered, commanders paced the line, checking straps, pulling men into formation with short, sharp gestures. And then they advanced, not as scattered probes, but as a single, focused push that rolled forward like a storm front. At first, the Roman wall answered the way it always did, signals snapping from tower to tower, horns calling measured notes, defenders stepping into place with the same disciplined calm they had used to build the works in the first place. But when the relief host reached the obstacle field, you could see Caesar's real idea at work. The cipi, those low-angled logs, forced the front ranks to weave instead of run straight. Hidden pits turned confident steps into cautious ones. Iron spikes in the mud stole speed in small, invisible ways. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was uncertainty. From a modern point of view, Caesar had engineered friction. He was draining momentum before it could even touch the wall. Still, numbers have their own weight. The front line slowed, but the ranks behind kept pressing forward. The crowd compressed. The ditch became a bottleneck. Men tried to bridge it with boards and bundles. Ladders rose toward the palisade. Hooks sought purchase. The air thickened with dust and shouted orders. On the parapet, Roman defenders waited for range, then released coordinated volleys, pila arcing out, arrows and bolts following in steady rhythm. Artillery crews worked their torsion engines like craftsmen, not gamblers. Everything about Rome's response said the same thing: we planned for this. And then, inside Alesia, the second half of the plan struck. Vercingetorix had been watching the relief push with the intensity of a man trying to will time into obedience. The moment he saw pressure peak on the outer wall, horns sounded inside the oppidum. Gates opened. Warriors surged down toward the inner Roman line. Now, Caesar's army was doing what almost no force can do well, fighting in two directions while staying organized. On the inner wall, Roman cohorts rotated positions in practice sequence, front ranks stepping back, fresh men stepping forward, shields aligning, spacing corrected in half steps. It wasn't heroic, it was professional. They held because they treated it like a system that must keep running. Between the walls, the corridor became a bloodstream of movement, runners, signals, reserve blocks shifting from junction to junction. Caesar's double ring wasn't just two walls, it was an operating structure designed to absorb shock. But at the rugged sector, shock kept coming. The relief army spear point found the pressure point it wanted. For a moment, the outer wall line looked strained, defenders bracing harder, tower crews reloading faster, officers shouting themselves hoarse while trying to keep rhythm. This was the kind of moment that breaks armies, not because of fear, but because of overload. A messenger reached Caesar with the simplest possible message: this sector is close to failing. Caesar didn't answer with panic, he answered with presence. He buckled his helmet strap, mounted, and rode hard along the corridor, past towers and timbers, past dust hanging in pale light, toward the seam. Soldiers on the parapet saw his cloak and straightened as if someone had tightened the entire line. Tired men lifted shields a little higher. Officers found their voices again. In modern terms, it's the power of visible leadership under stress. Morale isn't a feeling, it's a resource. Caesar spent it wisely. He arrived, dismounted, and began directing reinforcements with short, precise gestures, pointing at tower crews, ditch lines, and reserve positions. Fresh cohorts arrived in compact blocks, halted, and locked into the defense without disorder. The wall didn't magically become stronger. The system simply returned to its intended shape. Then, almost at the same time, another force moved, fast, dangerous, and perfectly suited for the moment. Germanic allied cavalry held ready between the walls, flowed out through a rear gate and rode hard along the perimeter. Dust trailed behind them in long bands. They weren't charging into the obstacle field, they were circling it, aiming for the relief warband's rear and flanks, where crowded formations are most vulnerable to sudden pressure. When they appeared behind the Gallic spear point, the mood of the relief assault changed instantly. You could see it in small human movements, heads turning, banner poles wavering for half a second too long. And half a second matters. Caesar signaled a coordinated push from the parapet, a short, disciplined surge to reclaim space, then a reset. Not reckless pursuit, not chaos, but just a timed shove that met the relief army at the moment its momentum was already cracking. The spear point blunted. The relief warbands began to pull back, first by steps, then by segments, then in a broader withdrawal as commanders tried to keep order while moving away from the wall they couldn't break. From the Roman parapet, defenders watched the dust cloud shift shape. The horizon that had felt like it was closing in now began to open again. But the battle wasn't finished yet, because inside Alesia, Vercingetorix could feel the rescue slipping away. He pressed harder on the inner wall, trying to force a breakthrough before the relief army fully disengaged. For a brief moment, one inner sector became dangerously tight, attackers finding footholds near the parapet edge, Roman defenders stepping back a pace, then locking shields again. When a report reached Caesar, he pivoted immediately. This is what made him so dangerous. He treated the entire battlefield like a single problem, not two separate fights. He left stabilization in the rugged sector to trusted officers, and moved along the corridor toward the inner crisis, arriving where strain was highest. Again, his presence mattered. Men who had been bending under pressure regained shape. A short, controlled counter-push restored the parapet edge. The inner line held. And then, the final signal reached Vercingetorix from the only place that truly mattered, the horizon. The relief host was leaving. From Alesia's ramparts, he watched banners drift away across the plain. Dust thinned.
fires grew smaller in the distance. The hope he had summoned, hope he had fed with unity and sacrifice, was turning into absence. That is the real turning point of Alesia. Not a dramatic collapse, a shift in belief. Rome's walls stood, Rome's system held, and Vercingetorix was left with the hardest truth a leader can face. The plan you built your people around has failed, and now you must decide what comes next. As evening fell, the Romans reset their positions. Runners slowed, reserves settled back into their junctions, tower crews resupplied calmly. On both rings, sentries kept walking their measured routes. And above it all, the wind snapped Roman vexilia and Gallic banners alike. Indifferent, constant, like the world reminding both sides that bravery is real, but preparation decides what bravery can achieve.
Morning at Alesia didn't feel like victory. It felt like the world had gone quiet on purpose. After days of shouting, horns, and endless motion along two walls, there was suddenly an emptiness in the air, like the wind itself was holding back. On Caesar's ramparts, Roman sentries stood with the same discipline as always, but even they moved more slowly. Across the plain, the dust of the relief army had settled. The horizon was wide again. Inside the oppidum, the silence cut deeper. Alesia still stood on its plateau, timber and stone holding the height. Hearth smoke still drifted from roofs, but the mood had changed from defiance to calculation. You could see it in the granaries, where sacks looked smaller than they should. You could see it in the ration bowls, filled just a little less. And you could hear it in the council hall, where arguments no longer sounded like confidence, only like people trying to decide which loss they could live with. Vercingetorix called the chieftains together one last time. This is the part of the story people often romanticize, but in reality, it would have been painfully practical. No speeches that could fill empty storehouses, no cavalry charge that could summon the relief army back from the horizon. Only a hard choice between two kinds of endings. Keep resisting, and time finishes the job. Attempt another breakout, and the Roman works, ditches, palisades, towers, and the maze of obstacles, turn speed into struggle. Or surrender, and hope that the tribe survives, even if independence does not. Vercingetorix listened, weighing not only strategy, but the fragile thing he had built, unity. He had brought tribes together that had spent generations fighting each other. One wrong decision now could shatter that unity into blame and vengeance. And if that happened, even survival would become uncertain. So he did what great leaders sometimes do at the end of a failed plan. He took the burden onto himself. The ancient sources frame this moment with dignity, and whether every detail is perfectly preserved or not, the meaning is clear. Vercingetorix chose surrender as a way to spare what could still be spared, not because he stopped believing in Gaul, but because he refused to let pride decide the last chapter. He prepared carefully, as if the manner of an ending could still protect the people inside the walls. He put on his finest armor. He took his best weapons, not to use them, but to lay them down. He mounted a decorated horse, and when the gate opened, he rode out alone. Down the slope, through mist and cold air, across the strip of land between Alesia and the Roman inner wall, what had been a battlefield now turned into a corridor of witnesses. On the Roman parapets, legionaries watched in silence. You can imagine the expression on their faces, the mixture of fatigue, disbelief, and the quiet respect soldiers often feel when they see the enemy's leader walk forward without flinching. Caesar waited at his command position. He didn't need to shout or posture. His walls had done the talking. His system had done the arguing. Now he only had to receive the result. Later accounts describe the surrender as deliberate theater, Vercingetorix riding a slow circle, then dismounting and placing his weapons at Caesar's feet, while Caesar remained seated. Some details may be polished by memory. History loves symbolism, but the message is unmistakable. The rebellion's center of gravity had stepped out of the fortress and offered itself up. Vercingetorix stood weaponless before the man who had built 2 rings of earth around his world. In that moment, it wasn't simply one commander accepting defeat. It was the end of Gaul's unified resistance as an organized force. After the surrender, the siege didn't end with cheers, it ended with procedure. The gates opened again, and warriors began to file out in long, orderly columns. Weapons were gathered into piles, shields stacked, spears bundled, helmets and blades counted and sorted. Roman officers stood with wax tablets, marking tallies, directing lanes, separating groups. It was victory transformed into administration, because that's what Rome did best. It didn't just win battles, it processed outcomes. From a modern point of view, this is one of the most chilling aspects of Roman power. The fight is dramatic, yes, but the real dominance shows itself afterward in the calm efficiency of control. The same discipline that held the wall now organizes the aftermath. And Vercingetorix? He wasn't treated like an ordinary captive. He was too valuable for that. He had become political currency, proof of Caesar's success, a living symbol that could be displayed later to strengthen Caesar's position back in Rome. So, while Alesia emptied and the weapon piles grew, Vercingetorix stood under guard, upright, composed, watching the plateau that had been his last refuge. For Caesar, the victory wasn't only military, it was strategic, political, and psychological. Alesia didn't just break a fortress, it broke the idea that Gaul could unite and throw Rome out. For the people of Gaul, the surrender wasn't just defeat, it was the beginning of a new reality, one where Roman roads, Roman law, Roman taxes, and Roman influence would reshape daily life. And as evening fell, fog returned to the valleys. Torches lit along the Roman parapets. The double ring still glowed in the darkness, not as a trap anymore, but as a statement. Alesia ended the only way it could. Not with a final charge, but with a leader choosing the least destructive ending, and an empire turning that choice into history.
After Alesia, the battle didn't end so much as it transformed. In the days that followed the surrender, the walls were still there. The ditches still cut through the hills. Towers still stood like ribs along the ridgelines. But now, the noise of combat was replaced by something quieter and, in its own way, more revealing: organization. Roman officers set up lanes and roped corridors. Scribes stood with wax tablets, scratching tallies with calm, practiced hands. Weapons were stacked into ordered piles. Shields, spears, helmets, sorted not as trophies, but as inventory. The same army that had built 2 rings of earth around the fortress now built a system for processing the aftermath. That's the part people often miss when they romanticize Rome. Rome didn't just win because its soldiers were brave. Rome won because it could turn chaos into paperwork, and paperwork into permanent control. Engineers walked the fortifications as if they were studying a blueprint. They measured tower spacing and ditch depth. They checked the obstacle fields, resetting logs and recovering pits, not because another assault was coming tomorrow, but because Rome preserved what worked. Alesia was no longer a desperate improvisation. It was a lesson written into the ground. In Caesar's tent, the war continued in ink. He wrote dispatches and sealed them in wax, not just to report victory, but to shape the story that would reach Rome ahead of him. Caesar understood that the battlefield wasn't only in Gaul, it was also in the Senate, where rivals watched every success with suspicion and every setback with hunger. So the message traveled fast. Couriers rode out along muddy tracks and Roman roads, carrying news that would change the political weather in the capital. And in Rome, the reaction was almost predictable. Senators gathered in marble halls and listened as victories were read aloud. Public celebrations began to appear in the streets near the Forum. The city didn't see Alesia's fog or hunger. It saw triumph, and triumph has a way of silencing criticism, at least for a while. Back in Gaul, control shifted from campaign to infrastructure. Roman roads began to push outward.
straight lines laid across landscapes that had once been defined by tribal boundaries and forest paths. Surveyors stood with sighting tools and plumb lines, aligning routes with the patience of men who believed the future belonged to geometry. Legionaries who had dug siege ditches now laid stones and compacted gravel, turning movement itself into a Roman advantage. Administrative posts followed. Roman standards appeared above new timber buildings. Officials began to meet with Gallic nobles, some cooperative, some cautious, passing tablets and terms as if the world could be reshaped by agreements. And in a generation, many parts of Gaul would begin to look different. Not overnight, not evenly, but steadily. If you could watch the change in one quiet room, it might look like a young Gallish noble leaning over a wax tablet, practicing Latin letters by lampshade. Not because his gods had changed, but because power had. A new language was becoming the language of opportunity, and the sons of leaders adapt quickly when the world shifts. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix became something else, a political object. He wasn't treated like an ordinary prisoner. He was too valuable as proof of Caesar's victory. He was kept alive for years because Rome understood symbols. A defeated leader displayed at the right moment could do what legions sometimes couldn't, break the will of future resistance. Years later, he would be brought to Rome for Caesar's triumph. It's one of the cruel ironies of history. A man who fought to keep his land independent ends up turned into a demonstration of someone else's power. Even then, accounts suggest he carried himself with dignity, because dignity is sometimes the last freedom left. And Caesar? Alesia didn't just secure Gaul, it made Caesar untouchable for a time. That victory gave him wealth, prestige, and the deep loyalty of veterans who believed they had survived something impossible under his command. But it also created a problem that no wall could solve. Because in the Roman Republic, a general who becomes too successful becomes dangerous to the system. Not because he intends to destroy it at first, but because his existence changes the balance of fear. Alesia shut down criticism in Rome, but it also raised the stakes of Caesar's future. When you become the man who can do the impossible, you stop fitting comfortably inside the rules made for ordinary men. That's why Alesia isn't just a siege story, it's a turning point in how power works. Militarily, it showed that engineering could be the decisive weapon, not as support, but as the plan itself. 2 rings of fortifications, layered obstacles, signal systems, and reserves positioned like parts of a machine. This became a template, studied and repeated. Politically, it cleared Caesar's path towards the next crisis, Rome itself. If you want to understand the legacy in modern terms, think of Alesia as a case study in systems thinking under extreme pressure. Caesar didn't win by being the strongest on the field. He won by designing the field. He built a controlled environment where numbers mattered less than preparation, communication, and discipline. He turned earth, wood, and time into tools of command. And he proved something uncomfortable, that the most decisive victories often look less like heroic moments and more like an organization functioning under stress. So when the fog lifts over Alesia and the camera pulls back, what remains isn't only a battlefield, it's a blueprint. A blueprint for Roman siegecraft, a blueprint for political survival, a blueprint for how one man's audacity, backed by method, can reshape an entire region. The plateau stands quiet again. The rivers still cut the valleys. Grass grows back over old earthworks. But the consequences keep moving forward, down roads, into cities, into the future. Alesia ended the rebellion. And it also made one truth impossible to ignore. Caesar didn't just conquer Gaul, he conquered the rules of what could be done. And that kind of victory never stays contained for long.